I believe that in our day, most people are afraid of poetry. People associate poetry with difficulty, ambiguity, hidden meanings, riddles, headaches. Why not just say it? If you have to say something, why not just say it? Why not say it in nice, good, clear prose? Your meaning is conveyed, and then we can move on. Why use meter? Why use rhyme? Why use symbol? Why use all the many devices of poetry that seem, to most of us probably, not to convey meaning more powerfully, but in fact to hinder our ability to get at the meaning? Well, in this class, we are going to be introduced to poetry, and one of my goals in this class, and indeed one of my goals in these various brief lectures, is to try to convey to you the pleasures of poetry, to try to show you how poetry in the beginning and throughout its very long and illustrious history has been designed precisely to give listeners, readers, more pleasure than prose. Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously said in his literary critical writings that this is one of the main goals of poetry, to give pleasure. Note, not to be deep, not to be profound, not to convey important meanings with a big M, but to give pleasure. So in this particular talk, I want to suggest to you the most basic pleasure, at least in my mind, of poetry, and that is its sound. How the sound effects of poetry allow it, as a literary genre, to give a wider array of pleasure than traditional prose does. Now, in talking about this, I'm going to be talking about sound in a fairly simple way. I'm not going to delve into the more intricate ways that poetry conveys sound, say with rhythm or meter or rhyme. I'm going to be talking about sound on a much more elemental level. You'll see what I mean in a minute. There are many ways to talk about differences between poetry and prose. And first, I should say that in some cases, the difference is negligible, if non-existent. If you read the prose of, say, Herman Melville, or James Joyce, or Virginia Woolf, or Toni Morrison, if you read that prose, the richness of sound and the intricacy of language make that prose function just like poetry would function. You can essentially treat certain lines, certain paragraphs in those writers like you would a poem, and you could analyze the rhythm and the meter and the rhyme, for instance. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 19th century American writer, famously said there really is no difference between prose and poetry. Any language that has power not only on the level of semantics, the level having to do with meaning and looking up words and such, but also on the sonic level. Any language that has those qualities can qualify as poetry. Emerson said, poetry is not meter, but meter-making argument, meaning that the full power of the argument of the writing has a kind of, if it's powerful enough, has a kind of rhythm to it. So I want to begin with that caveat. However, in the majority of cases, we can say, well, prose is written in sentences and poetry is written in lines. Lines that don't end simply in periods as sentences do, but lines that are broken, divided in ways that the poet chooses to convey their meanings. Prose, the basic unit of organization after the sentence, is the paragraph. In poetry, it's the stanza. And there are many different stanza forms in poetry that we'll learn about. I would say in general, prose, the kind of prose you read in textbooks and the kind of prose you read in newspaper articles, the primary purpose of prose is to convey as clearly as possible a graspable meaning. Whereas poetry in general is much more attuned to the complexities of life, the complexity of emotions, the struggle for the quest for meaning, those parts of human existence that are essential to us in defining ourselves and our place in the world, and for that reason are often difficult to grasp in an easy, cogent fashion. This is the realm of poetry. But on the most elemental level, I'm going to argue, the pleasure that poetry brings is the same kind of pleasure we get with the most basic childlike sounds. Say, for instance, onomatopoeia, sounds that do not convey their meaning based on semantics necessarily, meaning not necessarily based on what the word points to in a dictionary, but onomatopoeia describes words that are what they convey. They are the sounds that they point to. And that's the fun of onomatopoeia. There's no distinction between word and meaning. There's no distinction between sign and referent. The meaning is the word. The word is what it is about. And this, by the way, is probably the best definition of poetry that I can tell you, is that in a poem, the writer is using language in such a way that the language should be no different from the subject matter. That a poem about a storm should feel like a storm, say. So onomatopoeia is the most basic rendering of this idea of a collection of words that are what they are about. They exist as what they are intending. So, buzz, clink, bang, splash, tick tock, ding dong, hiss, clap, sizzle, clack. Fantastic. You could probably list several onomatopoeia examples in your own mind just right now off the top of your head. You could probably make some up. You could sit in your room or outside right now and listen to the sounds and then come up with words that you make up, onomatopoeia words that suggest that sound. So the pleasure of onomatopoeia, that is a basic pleasure of poetry, of the pleasure of sound before sound becomes meaning in a traditional way. This is why we like music. Think of music, instrumental music, music without words. The joy of that. That's sound. It's simply sound being sound. It's not sound pointing to clear meaning. Well, onomatopoeia has that quality to it. Well, what else has that quality? Nursery rhymes. Think of the joy that you felt when you were a child learning nursery rhymes. Hopefully that was part of your childhood. Maybe it wasn't, but it was mine. And those nursery rhymes, it doesn't matter what they mean necessarily. They're kind of meaningless. They're just strange. It's the pleasure of the sound effects, not just the words, but the rhyme and the rhythm as well. So, for example, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle. The cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. Now, what does that mean? Doesn't matter. It sounds great. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle. The cow jumped over the moon. If these sounds were in a language unfamiliar to you, they would still be pleasing to you. Again, the words mean, they signify, they affect you probably before you start attaching a traditional meaning to them. Yeah? Ba ba black sheep, have you any wool? Yes sir, 3 bags full. One for the master, one for the swain, one for the little boy who lives down the lane. Patty cake, baker's man, bake me a cake as fast as you can. I see the moon and the moon sees me. God bless the moon and the God bless me. So wonderful. And there are some poets of more recent time who have tried to write nursery rhyme sounding poems that really emphasize the nonsensical character of this particular kind of word construction. So Spike Mulligan, 20th century poet, this is part of one of his poems. On the ning nang nong, where the cows go bong and the monkeys all say boo. On the ning nang nong, where the cows go bong and the monkeys all say boo. Many of you know the famous Dr. Seuss poem, Green Eggs and Ham. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam, I am. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam, I am. So you see, these nursery rhymes, the kind of pleasure they give us, we can get this same kind of pleasure from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, where the sounds of the words affect us before we start attaching meanings to the words. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless demand, down to the sunless sea. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless demand, down to the sunless sea. William Butler Yeats, The Song of Wandering Angus. I went out to the hazelwood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel one and hooked a berry to a thread. Any number of poems, if you try to shut off for a second your meaning-making cognitions and just get the poems on the level of sound, fantastic. Emily Dickinson, there's a certain slant of light winter afternoons that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. So, onomatopoeia would be one example of this essential, basic, immediate pleasure of language. That's the word I'm looking for, I think, here. Immediacy. There's no mediation of the word between mind and, say, dictionary, but there's just an immediate effect like instrumental music will have upon us. Well, there are also what we could call nonsense verse, poems that are really predicated on the idea that certain word forms sound great. And an example of that would be, I want to pull this up here, Shakespeare loves this. In his songs, within his plays, he'll often have these wonderful songs that characters will sing, and one of the most famous, if not the most famous, is from Much Ado About Nothing, and it's called Sigh No More, Ladies, Sigh No More. That's the first line of it, and just listen to it and treat it almost as if you would a nursery rhyme. Sigh no more, ladies, sigh no more. Men were deceivers ever. 1 foot in sea and 1 on shore, to one thing constant, never. Then sigh not so, but let them go, and be you blithe and bonny, converting all your sounds of woe into hey nonny nonny. Sigh no more, ladies. I'm going to read it again. Sigh no more, ladies. Sigh no more. Men were deceivers ever. 1 foot in sea and 1 on shore, to one thing constant, never. Then sigh not so, but let them go, and be you blithe and bonny, converting all your sounds of woe into hey nonny nonny. Hey nonny nonny. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, but it sure sounds good. And certainly the nonsense phrase, hey nonny nonny, does signify in the poem basically saying, hey women, don't be so melancholy about men deceiving you. It's just going to happen. So just be merry, be silly. Don't take it so seriously. Hey, nani, nani. Convert all your sounds of woe into hey, nani, nani. Lewis Carroll, the famous author of the Alice books, Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, he really got the power of words detached from meanings. And he played around with this idea in poems like The Hunting of the Snark and Jabberwocky, which some of you might know, which goes like this in the first stanza. Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mom raths outgrabe." It has a rhythm to it. It has sonic pleasure to it. But what does it mean? Well, it means what it means. It means what it means. So this whole idea of meaning, I've been using that word a lot in this talk. In the context of this discussion about the immediate pleasures of language as sound, the idea of traditional meaning really doesn't pertain. We're talking about words before they mean. We're talking about words as things, words that simply are and affect us on a visceral level before we start doing the interpretive work of saying, oh, that means that means this. So throughout this class, I will emphasize this over and over again, that I know I sound like I'm a kindergarten teacher a little bit, but poetry's fun. And I want us to get that pleasure, that sonic pleasure, not necessarily before we go into the work of interpretation, but along with that work of interpretation. And I'm not saying the work of interpretation doesn't bring joy too. It does. It brings just as much joy, I believe, as these immediate sounds. So this is one way that poetry is different from prose, the ways that I've described in this talk.